Welcome, Bruins, to the 2022 Changemakers Summit, Emotional Labor at Work. This year is our second annual summit to serve the UCLA alumni community who champion diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organizations. We're excited to have you here to delve into the important topic of emotional labor. My name is Gloria Coe, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. For my visual description, I have brown hair, wearing a blue blazer with our Changemakers Navy Zoom background behind me. I serve as the Senior Director for Alumni Career Engagement, and I am part of the planning team that has brought our virtual summit together. You will meet our team throughout the week. If you are comfortable, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and rename yourself to include your graduation year and pronouns. To kick off the event, I would like to first begin with a land acknowledgement. UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tongva, Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honuke Vet-Am, our ancestors, the Ahihi-Rum elders, and the Iohe Enkem, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. We know many of you may be joining us from various locations. If you would like to see what native lands you are currently occupying, you can do so by visiting the link in the chat. I want to also acknowledge UCLA Health for their generous support of our summit. As the presenting sponsor of this week, we are thrilled to be partnering with their organization. You can learn more about their health equity efforts in the link in the chat. And again, we thank UCLA Health for being part of our Changemakers Summit team. We also want to thank the sustaining donors to the UCLA Alumni Association, whose donations make programs like this summit possible for our alumni community and the UCLA community at large. We encourage you to join the UCLA One Changemakers Summit group to continue the conversations in between sessions with one another. We also encourage you to connect with participants to share best practices and your experiences in your organizations. This is definitely the summit where we want to connect, keep sharing our stories. I think our stories will be key in this summit, and you'll experience many stories throughout our different sessions. So now I am excited to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Jenn Wells. Jenn received her BA from UCLA in 2007 in American Literature and Culture and has a minor in Education Studies. She received her master's degree in Higher Education Administration from New York University and her doctorate of education in Organizational Change and Leadership at University of Southern California. Her dissertation focuses on understanding the organizational influences on college chief diversity officers' ability to impact institutional change. Her career in education administration focuses on student leadership with an emphasis on identity development and social justice education. Jenn currently works as the inaugural Director of Equity and Inclusion for the Marlborough School, a 7th and 12th grade independent girls' school in Los Angeles. In this position, Jenn serves as the Chief Diversity Officer and a member of the school's senior leadership team. In addition to her formal role at Marlborough, Jenn is an independent consultant providing diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops for higher education and nonprofit organizations. Her workshops focus on implicit bias, racial justice, multiraciality, and gender and sexuality inclusion. We're thrilled to have her set the foundation for this summit, and I'm excited to welcome Dr. Wells to the stage.
Hello everyone. It is so wonderful to join my fellow Bruins today. I just wanted to share with you all that I'm feeling a little under the weather. So I just wanted to kind of set that context as we move forward today. But as I share my slides, I'm really excited to be able to kind of talk about this really important topic that I think gets overlooked a lot when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so I'm really excited that I was invited to kind of share the stage and talk to you all about this today. My format is really going to be more of a workshop in terms of the keynote. And so I'm hoping that we can go ahead and ground you all in some shared language. So looking at some definitions and how does that inform what we'll be talking about today. We'll then talk about what's the impact of doing emotional labor in the workplace, specifically around DEI work. And then hopefully we'll get into what can we do? What are some of those interventions that we can do as organizations, as coworkers, and even ourselves who get asked to do emotional labor work. And then I'll be able to invite Gloria back on, who will help me with a question and answer. And so I believe your chat is active, and so feel free to put things in the chat. I'll do my best to mind that as we go along today. Sometimes I'll even ask you if you want to put things in the chat, so please feel free to do that. So let's keep it moving. All right, so you might see this picture. This is actually a mug that I have even right here in front of me. And it might provide a little chuckle for you all as you think about maybe what does it mean to be doing emotional labor right now. This mug actually came to me after the summer of 2020. As you all know, this was the summer where we had the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and really thinking about how those kind of national attention to these deaths of Black folks really put an emotional toll on those of us who share that identity with folks. I know for me, what was really intense about being in the workplace at the time was I was witnessing people kind of grapple with race for the first time, something that I didn't have the privilege to do. I had actually been grappling with race my entire life as someone who's Black identified and multiracial. And in that kind of witnessing of grappling, we also have folks who are approaching us during that summer, asking us how we were doing, also wanting to know if we'd help with some of the DEI efforts that started as a result of those murders, and really taking on the labor of doing that. I put this mug up because I actually got a couple emails that summer that said, "Hey, Jen, can I pick your brain about XYZ?" And what was really difficult about that was that I was being asked for my labor without really being asked how I was doing, right? Or maybe someone did ask me how I was doing, but they kind of pushed through that and really was looking for me to provide my expertise around DEI and probably my own lived experience as a Black person. And so as we go through our time today, we're going to talk about what is that toll, what is that tax, what are ways that we can get that invoice paid, if you will, in many different ways. And so I just wanted to kind of enter with that kind of story in mind. So I believe you all were introduced to this definition by Hochschild from 1983 when the original emotional labor term was coined, right? And you could see that that original kind of definition was meant to be the management of one's feelings and emotions, and specifically how it went in, it was aligned with what was expected from us in terms of our organizations, right? In terms of maybe spoken rules and guidelines, but maybe even those unspoken. From my research and kind of preparing for this keynote, what I found was that a lot of times this was actually focused on the service industry. And so maybe it was something like doing customer service, right? Where maybe you're having a difficult interaction with someone you were serving as in terms of being a waiter and really needing to put on that smile, even though that customer might be treating you poorly. We also know that when we talk about this work of emotional labor, a lot of times we also end up talking about gender, for example, right? Maybe some of the ways that women have been more in the position of thinking about their emotions as they showed up for folks in the workplace and really managing those emotions. As time has passed, this definition has actually gone on and been expanded. I think if we were to ask Hochschild if this is what they intended, I'm not sure that that's aligned with the original work, but it is providing folks additional language on how to talk about what's being required of them in the workplace. And so Hartley offers us this additional piece of the definition, right? Where emotional labor is the management and life management combined. And some of the emphasis becomes then on the unpaid and invisible work that we are doing that keeps those around us comfortable and happy, right? And then you'll see again, and similar to what I shared earlier, some of this care-based labor is really related to our emotion work. It's related to mental load, burden, maybe some of that domestic management, clerical labor, and invisible labor, right? And some of you have probably seen this term pop up, maybe even around the holidays. Maybe those of you who celebrate Christmas, for example, we saw folks talk about emotional labor in terms of women who might, for their family, take on purchasing Christmas gifts and then wrapping those Christmas gifts and then putting up the decorations. All of these things that kind of maybe are associated with gender roles, if you will, in the home place. And so it's really interesting because in the articles that I read, they're basically, no, that's just plain labor, right? In terms of what folks are doing. But what I wanted to share that's kind of the grounding of what we're building off of today, right? The rest of today's conversation will really focus on the workplace. We'll focus on intersecting identities, and then specifically what happens around emotional labor when we, in those identities, are asked to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so I think many of us are familiar with this term of intersectionality. I offer this because throughout the presentation, I'm going to be talking about many different types of social identities specifically. You can see some examples listed on the right hand of the slide. So you see racial identity, gender identity, sexuality, ability, disability, neurodivergence falls under that. Nationality, ethnicity, all of those are going to be different types of identities that are going to be related to our conversation today. And as you know, Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term of intersectionality to really describe how we encounter oppression around these different identities, right? And understanding that these are interconnected, right? We can't take them separate from one another, right? Myself, as someone who identifies as a cisgender woman, who's Black, Filipina, and queer, I cannot take away any one of those and just examine them on their own. My experience, for example, is definitely tied to the fact that I have all of these identities as one. So if I'm talking about my queer identity, I am absolutely thinking about what does it mean to be a Black queer woman versus just queer, right? And so Kimberly Crenshaw basically calls into our attention that these things are very much connected. As we move forward in this conversation today, I'm really going to encourage you to take inventory on your own identities, right? Where do you hold your marginalized identities? So places where you have felt targeted by oppression or tokenization or discrimination, but also it is just going to be as important to think about our privileged identities. For example, some of the privileged identities I'm going to be holding as we talk today is I identify of a Christian faith background in terms of how I was raised. I identify as able-bodied, I identify as cisgender. And so as we do our DEI work, we all know that we're tasked with not only holding our marginalized identities, but also thinking about those privileged identities, because those are going to be those places where we can maybe pick up that emotional labor work on behalf of others. And so with that, we are going to move into this next definition. And so Catalyst is a nonprofit organization that I really, really enjoy and appreciate their contributions to the conversation. They did a study that specifically focused on emotional tax. And so as you could see, emotional tax for them was defined as the heightened experience of being different from peers in the workplace. And that could be because of your gender or your race, ethnicity, and also probably some of the other identities that we listed, like ability or religion or ethnicity, for example, and the specific associated detrimental effects on our health and well-being when we think about those things and our ability to thrive in work. And so when I think about this idea of emotional tax, right, we think about how am I, maybe in some of my marginalized identities, maybe I'm working at a predominantly white institution. What do I encounter as someone who holds that difference from my peers, right? Maybe I experience isolation or self-doubt. Maybe I experience what's called stereotype threat, where I might be worrying about fulfilling someone's perceived stereotype about myself based on the way that I show up. And so some of the ways that we begin to think about this is how might that emotional tax show up for us when we're thinking about these things. So when I'm thinking about the identities, the marginalized identities that I show up in, I might be having this emotional tax show up for me and thinking in the morning, what am I wearing? How does that align with what folks might perceive my gender or my sex or etc., right? Maybe it's the way I style my hair. I know that for many Black women, for example, they've been told that their hair is unprofessional because they're wearing a protective style, for example, or maybe even wearing locks, for example, in their hair. For others, when we think about what am I eating for lunch, maybe you brought some of your cultural food to work, and how is that going to be perceived by coworkers, and thinking about how they might think about what that looks like, right? We also might think about how do we speak in the workplace and how do we manage conflict? And so some of you and most of you might be aware of this idea of code switching. Maybe there is an idea of how we show up in our authentic selves with our safe communities. Maybe those are communities of color where we are getting to be our authentic selves and speak the way we want to. But then when we come to the workplace, because that way of speaking has more negative impacts or is perceived as unprofessional, we have to manage ourselves in how we show up in the workplace. And then again, I mentioned this idea of stereotype threat as something that's always on our mind in terms of managing what other folks are talking about. And so I raise these to really think about this idea of like what tax is on us as we show up as maybe feeling different in the workplace. A related definition that comes to mind is from Winters, who enters into this conversation the idea of emotional toll. And again, this also relates to emotional labor, right? This is the idea that there is extra effort when we encounter microaggressions, and I've added stereotypes and tokenization as well, but also things like discrimination and inequities and violence, or even bearing witness to the stories from others about their own experiences with these things, right? And then being able in that moment, as we encounter all of this, to manage the fear, the frustration, the anger, all of those emotions that result from basically being under attack through these kind of interpersonal experiences. One of the things I really wanted to pause here to give some examples of how I've seen this emotional toll show up in my work as someone who's worked in education, specifically in higher education with our students. And so what I'll do right now is share a few of those examples so you can kind of get an idea of what does that emotional toll look like, right? So for example, when I was in the beginning of my student affairs career, starting at NYU, I had the really great fortune of being one of our recruitment chairs for everyone entering the master's program. I made this people bingo card, and I don't know if you all are familiar, but basically you put different characteristics on a sheet, like a bingo card, and then the activity is people will take that card and go try and find people who match that description. At the time, this was before we had equality in terms of our marriage laws. And I had written as one of the squares, I am married, right? For me, at the time, as someone who was not aware of my queer identity just yet, I had written this down. One of my students came to me who was participating in this recruitment fair, right? His attention really should have been on how do I show myself as the best self I can be. Instead, he did this emotional labor to come up to me and tell me that not everyone could get married at that time. And that square meant to be a welcome activity, really meant that he could not participate, or he was excluded from that. That was something that for me, I then took on to make sure that I was always remembering that that was something to be mindful of. Another thing that I will share is while I was working at Mills College, I think about my students with disabilities. I oversaw orientation and really thought about kind of the schedule and where folks went. It took my students who had disabilities, both visible and invisible, coming to me to share with me how much that the schedule was actually impacting their ability to manage their energy throughout the day, and how they could not spend that much time kind of giving energy because of their invisible identity. In addition, a student in a wheelchair shared with me that she had had difficulty navigating the pathways to orientation because she was in a wheelchair and everyone else was kind of taking the stairs, which was a quicker way, and leaving her on her own to kind of navigate the ramp because of her wheelchair. And so again, for me, that's something that I now take into consideration when I plan these things, but took a student kind of sharing their burden with me in order for me to understand what was going on. Another example that I'll give, while I was at Scripps College, I felt really privileged to work with our Muslim Student Association, and specifically the president of that association. I believe this was a couple years ago, where Ramadan fell right specifically on finals week. At the time, there was no real meals accommodations. There was not necessarily the support campus wide for understanding what it meant to be fasting during finals week. I worked with that student to secure additional funding for meals for her community. I worked with that student to send out emails on behalf of students to faculty so that they can understand what that toll might take on them while they were fasting during finals week. And then really setting the tone for how could that student's funding be renewed every week. But again, when I think about her experience as navigating this Muslim identity within a school, that's really something I needed to be taking on as an administrator, and not really relying on her to kind of bring that to me and share that with me. I think the same thing is true for the students I work with at Marlborough. As Gloria mentioned, I do work at a girls' school, but we do have trans and non-binary students, right? And so a lot of the burden has fallen onto them to kind of really raise with their faculty. Are we sharing pronouns? How are we ensuring that dead names aren't shared? How are we ensuring the safety of trans students when they are coming out maybe in our school, but not necessarily ready to share that with their families, right? Again, that's labor or an emotional toll that's on them to kind of advocate for themselves. And then, as many of you know who've gone through UCLA and may have some of these marginalized identities, we know that in higher education for faculty of color, they are not only expected to maybe do well and be amazing, but they also are often asked to mentor and support students of color, something that's beyond their scope of work or paid work, right? And that creates additional labor for them that's not necessarily asked of their white peers. And not only that, right, there's this pressure to even be excellent, right? I even think about workplaces that I've been in where maybe all of the Black women have doctorates, but that same level of education attainment is not expected from others in the workplace. And so I just share all of those examples because one of the ways that I'm struck as a diversity officer about what it means for folks in my community to manage this emotional labor is, what do I need to take on through an institutional way to diminish the burden on these folks to identify their needs? What can I take away from or do proactively so that they don't have to keep sharing their stories? They don't have to keep experiencing that burden. And so I wanted to share this quote by Dr. Tema. Some of you might be familiar with her work, love following her on social media. She shares, not only do we have to educate others on our wounds, but then people want to regulate your emotions, that you shouldn't be upset as you explain things that are upsetting. Like, this is outrageous, but if I looked outraged, then it is deemed unacceptable that I am the problem. People are more concerned about Black people's anger than things that we're angry about. This is exhausting and problematic. I mean, I'm sure many of us can think about maybe times where someone in response to discrimination or microaggressions got angry, upset, had an emotional reaction, and we saw our peers or maybe those in leadership react more harshly to that person that was the victim of the discrimination or microaggression than they did to the person who actually committed that discrimination or microaggression. And so again, how do we begin to really think about where we're putting these resources as folks have to manage these emotions in work? And so what is the impact of emotional labor? And you can already hear some of these things. We'll start first with employees. And again, those of you who are watching, feel free to put some of the impacts that you've experienced in the chat. But we know that when folks have to put forward this tax, this toll, this impacts their self-confidence. They experience stress and depression. They might develop panic disorders as they try to mitigate their emotions in response to showing up in those official rules and guidelines that we talked about. We know that this also impacts your energy level. So if I'm dealing with all of this discrimination or all of these microaggressions, how then do I have the energy to do the labor that's required of me in my workplace? That can then lead to job dissatisfaction. We know that that might even impact someone's career path. I can even share with you, when I think about the jobs that I've been in, some of them have been quite short because of the fact that it was a lot of emotional labor I was doing in my marginalized identities to be able to show up and be my full self. We also know that this can have an impact in terms of being able to experience or access senior leadership. And then also what spheres of influence folks have. And then all of that impacts your earning potential in the long run. I also wanted to include the impact to organizations in terms of emotional labor. One of the things I want to caution against while I talk about this, though, is we always hear in our work this idea of the business, ooh, this is where my words are failing me, but the business objective of DEI work. And I don't want us to get, thank you, yes, Leslie, the business case for diversity, right? I don't want us to get lost in these are very real outcomes, right? So service quality deterioration or decreased satisfaction, performance reduction, and then as we're experiencing right now with the Great Resignation, turnover. I don't want this, though, to become the major reason why we address emotional labor. When I think about this, how many of us have been involved in the recruitment of a diverse workforce, whether that's race or gender, et cetera. And then when folks get to that workplace, we're not really thinking about the systems that are in place to retain them, right? And so when we think about those things, that's not just for our bottom line in terms of the business case, that's for the humanity and dignity of those folks that we've decided to bring into our organizations. And so while the business case, I think what's interesting about the business case for diversity is it's really made for those with privileged identities. That business case doesn't really help me in my marginalized identities. And so how do we make sure that when we talk about this work, we're really focusing on who this matters to, and those are the folks who are encountering these systems of oppression in our workplace. So we, like I said, we kind of already just shared what it's like to just have a marginalized identity, but then let's add this layer of being asked to do DEI work on top of our marginalized identity. And oftentimes, a lot of us are asked to do this work because we might be qualified. And part of those qualifications is that we hold these identities. But also, it might just be because folks are wanting to do this work and they don't know how to turn or where to turn. And so we then get asked to do DEI or identity-based work. So not only am I thinking about all these things on the left, now when I'm asked to do this DEI work and this identity work, I have to ask additional questions, right? And worry about additional things. Am I going to get compensated or a title change or resources for this new ask for DEI work? Will I be asked to share my story, right? I think we heard a lot about these ideas of diversity trainings and dialogues that really put folks from marginalized identities on a spotlight to have to share their pain and their story at the learning of other folks versus what am I actually getting if I share this story? Am I feeling supported? Am I getting anything out of that? Maybe I have to ask myself, do I even have the skills to facilitate this difficult dialogue? What emotions do I have to manage as I listen to folks talk about bias and discrimination and oppression? In addition to that, because of all of the violence and unwelcoming behavior that I've encountered, what triggers come up for me in the face of this ignorance and harm? And so, like, when I think about my privileged identities, for example, I think about how none of this I really need to do. It's really, I'm living my life and I'm welcomed. But when I think about this from my marginalized identities perspectives, this is a lot that piles up. And that's exactly why we're here today, to really think about how do we lessen this on folks of marginalized identities. So then again, focusing more on DEI work, Myers talks about this idea of emotional labor being the doing work that's emotionally distressing, where you have to hide your feelings, right? This can, the examples that she provides was managing her emotions when someone shares something that's racist that happened to them. So that's, again, secondary kind of listening. But also having to give myself a pep talk before a charged conversation. Maybe in my role, for example, at Marlborough, I'm often meeting with faculty who might have said something problematic or racist or classist in the classroom, and having to kind of manage my emotions in order to be able to show up in a way that's helpful to them in that conversation. In addition, right, maybe when I'm in a meeting talking about, so for example, working in student affairs, maybe I'm talking about what my students of color are experiencing on the day-to-day that resonates deeply with my own lived experiences. I have to manage my emotions in order to stay present in that conversation, right? That probably shows up for you. And then thinking again about systemically excluded groups, right? Who are often pushed to do this labor when themselves have experienced these harmful experiences. One of the examples that I actually wanted to provide to you, and I know that this is, I get mixed feedback on this, but I have a hard time with our Heritage Month's approach to DEI work, for example, right? Especially when that work is really required of folks of that identity. And so, for example, when I worked at Mills College, during Black History Month, it was such a wonderful an amazing showcase of the Black students, Black faculty, and Black staff. But what I also saw was all of my Black students who were student leaders, who were really charged with this programming, not necessarily be able to show up for their schoolwork, not be able to necessarily, with taking on a lot of stress in terms of management of the calendar or advertising or the events themselves. And when I really think about that, and I encourage you to think about this, white students are not doing the same amount of labor to get their white heritage and white history kind of showcased in our curriculum or in our programming, right? And so really thinking about who are we putting this work on, and what additional expectations do we have of folks because of their identities? It's a really great question to ask, right? Like, if I'm asking someone because of their identity to do this labor, it is likely that it is a form of emotional labor. As Gloria kind of mentioned, I have my doctorate in a doctorate of education from USC. We won't talk about that. But basically, I did study organizational change and leadership, and my dissertation specifically focused on chief diversity officers who are in small liberal arts colleges. And I really looked at the different organizational resistance that they experienced in trying to create change in their work. I was really struck by the fact that in doing this research on emotional labor, that a lot of folks are actually looking at the viability of the chief diversity officer position. And so Bloomberg actually did a study, and they looked at the average tenure of these positions. So for chief executive officer, that average tenure was 6 years. Then for me, I asked myself, what other job would I have no interest in doing? And that might be chief financial officer. For them, their tenure at a company is often 5 years, right? This is where I'm like, ooh, you all are in the chat. Can you guess what the average tenure in terms of years are for chief diversity officers, according to Bloomberg? Maybe put some guesses. We have 2, 6 months. Yep, I love it. 2, 1 to 2. And this is what's really interesting for me. I think I've seen more of 1 to 2. Bloomberg study showed 3, right? And so this is still significantly different than 6 and 5 years, right? And when I think about this difference, I'm thinking about, again, all of that emotional toll that we've already kind of talked about, but then adding the layer of trying to create organizational change as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion in an organization where often these organizations are founded on principles that are based in white supremacy or based in ableism or based in sexism, right? So I really enjoy this because I get to share a little bit of my research. Here's a quote from one of my participants from my dissertation. She said, "I think I am often asked to carry out an unreasonable workload. And I think in part it is because they don't recognize how much capacity this work requires. Even thinking about when we are the ones who are hearing from people retell their stories of bias on campus, that we are carrying those students, staff, and faculty who are feeling unwelcome. Then showing up in spaces where there isn't a whole lot of cultural competency and having to always be the one that is raising the issue and having to be the one that is correcting when people say something that's incorrect or insensitive. It takes a lot of capacity. I think I would like them to understand that. I would also like them to understand how to be a better ally to me and to others on campus who do this work." And so for me, you can see how this highlights some of the things we've already been discussing about what does it mean to have witness folks tell her about their experience with bias on campus, or think about being the one to constantly ask folks, what about this? What about this with issues related to DEI? And again, that goes back to that emotional tax and the emotional toll of having to be different in the workplace, but also experience all of those experiences of marginalization or tokenization, right? And so this is something that one of my chief diversity officers said. And so that brings us to what can we do, right? We know, like, a lot of us have probably experienced this. Like I said, I'm going to ask you to focus both on your privileged identities and your marginalized identities as we think about what can we do. And I'm going to break it down in 3 different places. We're going to start at the organization level and kind of what is that institutional responsibility in addressing emotional labor. Then we're going to think about what does the interpersonal look like? Like, what does it mean to be a coworker of someone who is getting asked to do this emotional labor or doing this emotional labor? And then what do we need to do for ourselves as we get asked to do emotional labor? So let's start with organization. The first is to acknowledge that emotional labor even exists, right? A lot of times, and you saw that in the definition, this work goes unacknowledged. Part of the suggestions that I found included creating an audit of where emotional labor might be happening for employees so that you can start to acknowledge and recognize that. As I alluded to in the first slide with that mug, compensate, right? How are we thinking about where emotional labor shows up? And how are we either giving additional compensation for that? Are we giving extra titles for that work? Are we creating releases from other work for the additional work of DEI, for example? And how do we compensate that? The example that I'll give, and I encourage all of you to even think about this, at Marlborough, we do have these affinity groups, and these are identity-based groups for faculty and staff, and then also for our students. I know that the faculty and staff that are advisors to our student groups do additional labor that is not required of say, other committees. And part of that really looked like getting them an additional stipend to recognize that emotional labor that they are doing. That's not the same as advising the film club. You know what I mean? Additionally, so policies and procedures, right? How can we start to address the structural barriers or shortcomings that we produce this call for additional labor? And then kind of alluded to in the quote that I showed you earlier, right? How do we begin to build up the company-wide DEI competency of everyone so that that work does not just fall onto either those of us who have marginalized identities that are asked to do DEI work, or those who just plainly have marginalized identities and are existing in our spaces. That reminds me of what I shared with you all in terms of the work that I did to make sure that Ramadan wasn't something that a student had to raise up to our attention every year, but instead was something that was built into our calendar considerations throughout the year. Then we think about resources. Not only do we need to give DEI practitioners the adequate amount of resources, we also need to think about how do we create transparency in getting additional resources as that work continues to grow. One of the things I found in my research was that one chief diversity officer is really charged with the work that touches every aspect of an organization, and you need resources to be able to do that. And so how are we set, and we'll see this in a little bit, we might be setting up our DEI practitioners for failure if we're not giving them those resources. Similarly, how are we engaging folks in realistic expectations? One of the things I share when I've had interviews for these DEI roles, I say, I'm not going to eradicate racism in this organization. It existed before me and it will likely exist after me and while I'm here. What I can do is help us build strategies to counteract those things and really move on those things. And so what are those outcomes that we are expecting? And then holistic support. So what does this mean? This means that if we are asking folks to do DEI work and we're asking from a genuine place where they can say no, or they can ask for additional compensation, we also need to think about how are we supporting them in doing that? Are we just asking for their labor, or are we also making sure that they have access to therapy or employee assistance programs, or really thinking about the things that they're experiencing that have led to their negative experiences within our company, right? What does that holistic experience look like? And so that actually brings me to another quote from my dissertation. This was one of my favorite quotes that Devin, and again, these names have been anonymized. He said, they construct these jobs like we are some kind of magical creatures with the ability to persuade and convey to people why diversity work is important. And I always push back on that because I'm like, do you hire, ooh, and that is a missing letter that should say CFO. Do you ask the chief financial officer and tell them that they have no portfolio, no budget, nobody reports to them, and they have to convince every single other, an expletive there, vice president on how to spend money, how to spend their money, and that every single one, if they can come up with their own completely different financial policies, we would never do that. But we do this with chief diversity officers all the time. This is standard practice, right? So when we think about this idea of how can structures support, how can resources support our chief diversity officers or DEI work, those things can really do a lot to manage some of that emotional labor. Additionally, when we think about holistic support, the idea of psychological safety comes up, right? Myers defines this as the belief that you won't face retaliation or humiliation, right, for speaking up for ideas, questions, concerns, and making mistakes. At work, psychological safety is shared belief that those who you work with will not reject or embarrass you. So for example, when we think about those who are raising issues of how things are inequitable in the workplace, who are raising how something might be sexist or classist or against folks who are undocumented or not inclusive of trans and non-binary folks, are preferentiating those who might be Christian, for example, will I get met with psychological safety when I bring those things up? Or will I get met with rejection or embarrassment? As you all are leading in your organizations, here are some questions by Myers that you can ask to promote psychological safety. So things like, how will our team communicate while disagreements occur, right? How do we manage conflict as a team? How are we continuing to build trust as a team? And then again, what are desired and unacceptable behaviors when it comes to team conflict, and being very clear on those things. So next, moving to the interpersonal, and I kind of phrase it as like, what does it mean to be a coworker? We've all seen this. I don't know if you, well, we've been told this. Why can't you just Google it, right? So doing your own research. I actually, I was talking with some colleagues, right, and we kind of acknowledged though that Google might not be always the best place to kind of get your information. And so how can you utilize the resources within your organization, or think about scholars or creators that are producing information about DEI work so that you ask them first instead of turning to folks who have marginalized identities? And then going a step further, once you do utilize those resources, how are you compensating or amplifying the work of those folks that you're using, right? Thinking about, I'm not just gonna walk up, say another Black person was murdered by the police tomorrow. I'm not going to just walk up to a Black person and be like, what do you need me to know about being a better ally? That is probably, there are many articles written at this point that you can use to kind of get that information and then put it in practice. And maybe even it's like, how do I find folks with similar privileged identities to do that work with versus going to the person with the marginalized identity? The next is to be an advocate, accomplice, or allyship. And I put all of those because I think they work in different ways where maybe an advocate, someone who stands up for someone, the practice of allyship being more doing things that you can do, but accomplice is kind of subverting the system, right? And I learned that from my students in terms of what they were looking for. I think they phrased it as comrades, right? In terms of what they were looking for other people. But how do I intervene when emotional labor is being asked of my colleagues? Are there things that I can do to help redistribute that labor or take on some of that labor, or to make sure that that labor is compensated, right? And I'm mitigating that emotional task. I see in the chat that Chris has asked, what is my definition of a privileged identity? So Chris, these are going to be identities where we experience benefits that are not necessarily unearned, but more based on how society has been structured to remove barriers to access to resources and things. And so, for example, when we think about race, that might be being white, for example, right? Or as I mentioned earlier, being able-bodied, or being cisgender, or having a Christian faith background. And when I talk about Christian backgrounds, I think about, again, right, I don't have to ask my employer for days off during my holidays. Those are built into the United States calendar. Whereas some of my other colleagues might have to go and talk about emotional labor, have to go to their employer, go to their faculty member and say, hey, my culture celebrates this holiday at this time. It's not accounted for on the calendar. Can I take this time off, right? So that's what I mean when I talk about privileged identities. And then the last part of what we can do as coworkers is to take up your power, right? When I was prepping for this with Gloria, we kind of talked about this idea of, you might just feel like just a team member right now. Maybe you don't feel like you have a lot of access to positional power, but I do want to challenge you to think about where you might have just power within, or power with, right? Maybe it's setting up your agenda, or it's putting practices into place, or it's modeling the behavior. Where do you have power or even influence in your organization? And what are some of those small things that you can do that kind of mitigates, again, that emotional labor for folks? I put this up. This was circulating. This is Anastasia Collins made this sample invoice, right? So when we think about compensating, I think these prices are wildly discounted, just so we're clear. But you can see that she has kind of put forward this idea. And again, this is not meant to be, I think, a serious thing, but maybe just to have us kind of engage with as we're thinking about it, right? What does it mean to help someone else understand the isms? What does it mean to endure a microaggression? What labor am I doing that you could have Googled it and I gave you my time, right? What does it mean that I had to share my pain with you to move you? What does it mean to make you feel like you are actually helpful to me when you offered allyship and just let you sit in discomfort versus letting you sit in discomfort about not feeling resolved in that moment, maybe, right? And I thought this was interesting to share because I think it highlights some of the ways that that emotional labor shows up for marginalized identities. And so really thinking about this the next time you ask to pick someone's brain or ask someone to take on something just because of their identity. And then this is kind of where I'll end, is like when we are asked then to do emotional labor, one of the things is thinking about our workplace boundaries, right? When can you say no? How can you ask for additional compensation or a title change for what you've done related to DEI work? Is there long-term kind of assessing, like, is this too much work that you're being asked to do in your organization? And is this really a good fit? Again, I think this is why we're seeing some of the great resignation show up, right? Folks are like, this is too much. My boundary is here and I'm moving on, right? And then not making sure that you're not taking it in internalizing institutional problems to be a personal problem and helping keep the conversation focused on institutional support. I then move over to self-care and thinking about how are we practicing our own wellness, right? Spiritual wellness, physical wellness, and addressing triggers and emotions in maybe therapy, right? So like if you know you have triggers, not for the purpose of giving any labor to your organization, but just for you and your emotional wellness, maybe you are seeing a therapist to like work through those triggers or emotionally prepared so that you could be in the workplace. And then lastly, this is my favorite. I really think about building a community of support. When I worked at the Claremont colleges at Scripps, I had an amazing, wonderful group of colleagues, both at Scripps and then at the colleges surrounding, that really helped me think through all of the issues that I was kind of navigating, and really became an additional layer of emotional support as I did that emotional labor, right? Are there colleagues who might share your identities with you, but then also maybe there are some trusted allies or even sponsors that you can talk to as well. And then before I close my time and ask Gloria to come back on for question and answer, I think taking a time just to ask yourself what you took away from this presentation is really thinking about setting a plan, right? What is something you want to do within your organization to address emotional labor? What's something you can do as you think about your interpersonal interactions with other folks? And really for those two, really focusing on those privileged identities. And then for yourself, if you are someone who gets asked to do emotional labor from maybe one of your marginalized identities, what's something that you can do or a commitment you can make to yourself to really take that on? And then I always say, with any sort of plan, really thinking about your accountability partner, right? Who's going to help you kind of make sure that you're checking in and making progress towards these goals? For that might be someone different for each of these, or maybe that's one person for organization and coworker versus someone else for self. But really thinking about for yourself, what kind of plan do you want to create, knowing that you have this understanding of emotional labor now? And then before we go to question and answer, I'll just say you can always email me at jennwells@gmail.com. I'm also on Instagram, Dr._Jenn Wells. And then please feel free to add me on LinkedIn as well. And with that, I will ask Gloria to rejoin us for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wells. Jenn, that was fantastic. I wanted to, if anyone has any questions, feel free to add them into the Q&A function. But I actually, I did have, a question for Jenn, in that with all this, I want to thank her for this presentation, because I think she gave us all a lot of language and words to use for things that we experience. We don't quite know how to address it and bring it up. For those of us that lead teams, I think understanding these concepts, if maybe you haven't gone through them, understanding this so that when it comes in front of you, you don't have to ask your team member to verbalize everything. Right. Hopefully this is something that can help prime you so that you can, meet them where they are, rather than having them deliver all of the pain and the emotional labor that they have going on to you. But I also think, I love what you said, is compensate. I think that that's something that we want to empower those of us that are part of this summit to really think about. I have a question for you. As you said, sometimes there are so many ways that people don't budget for this kind of work. They don't have the financial, money per se. Are there other sources of compensation, Jenn, that you've seen in your experience that, again, that we can, as our summit participants, be ready to, okay, great, you don't have a budget for me. This is what I want instead.
Yeah.
Because I think that's something too, is like, what else can I ask for?
Yeah, I love that question, Gloria, and I'll try and do my best and actually welcome other folks in the chat to chime in too, because I feel like everyone's kind of tackling this question. So the first thing I would say is maybe it's not the full amount. Maybe it's not, here's the amount of money that would fully honor the work, but maybe I can do some gestures, right? So maybe that gesture is like, we provide lunch for our employee resource groups, right? Or I provide them with a little bit of money so that they can do some community building, for example. For me, one of the ways that I've seen it happen at some of the places I've worked at is really thinking about these things as like work releases, right? So instead of having set some of the same requirements that makes your job kind of equal to other folks, maybe you have to teach less classes or join less committees because you are focused on this work of supporting DEI work, and really thinking about that, because like in the absence of additional compensation, that at least allows you to get like you're not being asked to do more on top of what you're already doing. And so those are some of the things that come to mind. But I then say like that might go towards, or this goes back to the organizational, is like our budgets tell stories, right? If your budget is not telling the story of how much you value DEI work or your employees who have these marginalized identities, that is really your leadership's job, or really your role as a DEI officer, is to really make that case. And hopefully, again, some of the language today really highlights how you might be able to do some of that.
Great, thank you for that. I do have one question from Christian. He asked, it's easy to feel the magnitude of this work for BIPOC folks who live this work. What are some easy, effective ways to call someone in to this work? You can't lead diverse teams if you don't live a diverse life.
Yes. Oh, Christian, what a great question. It's really funny because I recently had a conversation, again, someone asked to pick my brain about how they could diversify their organization. And they kind of shared, that they were mostly white, they were mostly wealthy. And I had to have a really hard conversation with them about like, hey, that might be why people aren't joining you. You can tell people you want them the whole time, but unless you're really thinking about what are those barriers that really welcome folks into your organization, if you're not addressing those barriers, folks are going to continue to be like, you could ask all you want, but there's nothing to propel them to join that cause. And then when I think about I think you're right, Christian asked this question, because when I think about even at Marlborough, as we do more work to kind of bring on more faculty of color, for example, I have to ask myself, the job is like, is this responsible to bring folks into my workplace if we're not addressing these things? And so I think being realistic with folks is probably the best thing you could do to honor them in terms of calling them in, right? So as you're welcoming folks into your workplace, if you know that there's XYZ that you're still working on as an organization that might not help them feel supported or welcome, naming that so that they can make the active decision to still join you, knowing that that's the uphill battle that you're facing, or allows them to be like, I need more support at this time in my life, and being able to do that, because I agree with you, right? Like we can't build that inclusive space without those voices, but we also think about what kind of environment are we bringing those voices into, and it's almost parallel work that has to happen at the same time.
Great, thank you, Jenn. And so I wanted to first thank you, Jenn, for your presentation, your thoughtful curation, really, of all of this information that oftentimes I think, again, like we said, we often don't have the words for. So how do we move forward? And thank you for really setting the stage for the transparency you've provided and you've shared with the group. But I also want to say thank you, Jenn, for modeling that transparency. I think for all of us, this is what we want for the summit, is for our summit attendees to be able to listen, but then also to be able to share your stories, share your ideas, share, what you're going through, because it's not just you all by yourself. You have a community around you in the UCLA alumni community too that want to walk with you through this. And so thank you, Jenn. I want to close our session because we are at time. We look forward to everyone being able to join the rest of our different sessions. Today at 6:30, we have a conversation with UC President Michael Drake, which actually is a fantastic conversation. It's going to be a great opportunity to really learn about his story, but then also his vision as well for the UC as we move forward. Also, if you are in Los Angeles, we do have a Summit Connections Mixer tomorrow as well. It is in person. So be sure, if you can come, we welcome you to come to connect with other Summit participants as well. And again, also, we have all these different sessions tomorrow, Thursday at noon, also Friday at noon. You will get emails with all of their links, but all of the links are on our Summit website as well. And so again, thank you to Jenn. Thank you for all of her work and for her presentation today. We look forward to seeing everyone throughout the week. Go Bruins!